Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura. Today we are going somewhere unusual because the story is not a product launch or a funding round. It is a piece of mathematics.
I have been genuinely impatient to get to this one, Chris, because it is the rare AI story where the claim is precise enough that outside people can actually check it. And several serious mathematicians already have started doing exactly that.
Set the scene for anyone who missed it. What exactly did Anthropic say happened, and when did they say it? Because with a story like this, the specific details matter far more than the headline ever will.
On August 10th, Anthropic published a research post about an unreleased version of Claude that improved a proven lower bound tied to the Riemann hypothesis, pushing it from 41.6% all the way up to 67.2%.
Before we go a single step further, we owe listeners the background, because the phrase Riemann hypothesis gets thrown around as shorthand for the hardest problem in mathematics, and most people have never actually seen what it claims.
Here's the shortest, honest version. There is a function called the zeta function, and it has an infinite collection of interesting zeros, meaning input values where the output equals exactly nothing. Riemann conjectured that every one of those non-trivial zeros lines up on a single vertical line in the complex plane, the one where the real part equals 1/2. Mathematicians call it the critical line.
And why does anybody outside pure mathematics care whether some abstract zeros sit neatly on a line? Because that is the part that usually gets waved away in about 4 seconds by every popular explanation I have ever read.
Because those zeros secretly control how the prime numbers are distributed. If they all sit on that line, the primes are about as evenly spread as they could possibly be, and an enormous amount of downstream number theory suddenly becomes provable rather than conjectural.
So it is load-bearing. There are apparently hundreds of published results that begin with the words assuming the Riemann hypothesis, which is a slightly terrifying way to have built a large chunk of an entire mathematical field.
Hundreds is right, and that is precisely why it carries a $1 million prize and why it has resisted every serious attempt since Riemann wrote it down back in 1859. Nobody has come genuinely close to a proof.
Let us be very clear then, because nobody proved it here either. I want listeners to understand the gap between what actually happened and what a lot of people online seem to believe had happened when this went around.
Correct, and I want to be emphatic about it. Nobody proved the Riemann hypothesis. What improved is a partial result, a lower bound, which is a statement of the form at least this percentage of the zeros are definitely sitting on the line.
So the mathematical community has spent a century slowly ratcheting that percentage upward, and each ratchet has been a serious career achievement for whoever managed it. Walk me through that history because I suspect the pace is the entire story.
It starts with Hardy in 1914, who proved infinitely many zeros sit on the line, which sounds impressive until you realize infinitely many can still be 0% of a larger infinity. Selberg cracked the quantitative version in 1942 with a technique called a mollifier, proving a positive proportion.
And then things crawled, if I am reading the timeline correctly, which is not a criticism of anybody involved. That is simply what frontier mathematics looks like up close, when you stop reading the summaries and start reading the papers.
They crawled. Levinson reached roughly a third in 1974. Conry pushed past 40% in 1989. Buey, Conry, and Young reached about 41% in 2011, and Pratt, Robles, Zaharescu, and Zaindler nudged it to roughly 41.7% in 2020.
Give me the rate, because I think the rate is the number that actually communicates how hard this problem is to somebody who does not have a background in analytic number theory, and never will.
Across the 46 years from Levinson to that 2020 paper, the bound moved about 8 percentage points total. That is roughly 0.2 of a point per year, moved by some of the best number theorists alive at the time.
And this result claims to add about 25 percentage points in, a day and a half? That is the sentence that made me sit up and also the sentence that made me immediately suspicious of the framing.
2 sessions across about a day and a half, 31 million output tokens, roughly 2,400 shell commands, and 60 orchestrated subagents working the problem in parallel. Those are the production numbers Anthropic reported in the post itself.
Break the subagents down for me, because I think the internal composition of that swarm tells you far more about how this actually worked than the headline percentage improvement ever could manage on its own.
This is my favorite part of the whole story. Of the 60, only 2 developed the key mathematical ideas. 13 fed ideas into those 2. 13 more acted purely as validators, 2 helped draft the paper, and 30 tried and failed outright.
30 out of 60 produced nothing at all. Half the swarm was, in effect, wasted compute, and Anthropic published that number rather than quietly rounding it away, which I do think is worth crediting them for.
And it goes deeper. Roughly 650 ideas failed before the attempt that finally worked. The system also downloaded 54 papers from a preprint archive and ran thousands of numerical checks against known zeta zeros.
So the honest description here is not a machine having a sudden flash of insight. It is a machine running an enormous, cheap parallel search over a space of ideas and occasionally hitting something that survives checking.
That is the honest description, and I would argue it is more interesting than the flash of insight version, because search that cheap fundamentally changes which problems are economically worth attacking in the first place.
Let me play devil's advocate, and I want to do it seriously rather than as a rhetorical move. Critics say the system connected existing tools rather than inventing genuinely new mathematics. Is that a fair characterization of what happened?
It is a fair characterization of what happened and an unfair characterization of why it matters. The construction leans on Weil's quadratic form and on pair correlation techniques that Montgomery introduced back in 1973, plus a recent series of papers from Baluyot, Goldston, Suryajaya, and Turnage-Butterbaugh, and a paper from Bombieri published in the year 2000.
Which raises the obvious objection. If the ingredients were all sitting there in the public literature, why had nobody combined them? And does that tell us something about the machine or something uncomfortable about human research attention?
I think it tells us something about attention, honestly. Combining known tools in a non-obvious way is most of what research actually is, and human researchers can only afford to explore a handful of combinations per year before the funding runs out.
Whereas this thing explored 650 of them and did not get bored, did not get discouraged, and did not have to justify the failed attempts to a committee at the end of a grant cycle.
That last point is badly underrated. The cost of a failed idea just collapsed. When failure is nearly free, the optimal strategy shifts from carefully choosing one promising path to aggressively sweeping an enormous number of mediocre ones.
All right, let us talk verification. Because for me, this is the part that determines whether the story is a real result or an unusually well-decorated press release. Who has actually looked at the mathematics itself?
Internally, 2 Anthropic mathematicians named Levin Alpoge and Ralph Furman examined the work. Externally, Brian Conray and Dan Goldston both reviewed the paper, and the reported description was a favorable examination conducted on fairly short notice.
Conray is a genuinely meaningful name to have on that list, given that he personally set one of the earlier records on this exact bound back in the late 1980s, so he knows the terrain intimately.
He does, and Goldston is a co-author on the recent papers the construction depends on, so these are not casual outside observers. They are among the small number of people qualified to spot a subtle error quickly and confidently.
But favorable examination on short notice is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. And I do not want to let it slide past listeners as though it were the same thing as peer review.
It absolutely is not the same thing, and to their credit, Anthropic says so plainly. The work has not been submitted to a journal, it has not undergone peer review, and the wider community has not yet absorbed it.
There is also a formal verification angle here that deserves more attention than it has gotten, because I suspect it matters considerably more in the long run than this particular bound ever will.
A formalization was produced in Lean, which is a proof assistant, and it passes the standard validation tooling. That means a machine has mechanically checked the logical skeleton rather than a tired human reading symbols on a page at midnight.
And that seems like the actual infrastructure story, hiding inside this news cycle. If machines are going to generate mathematics at volume, the bottleneck stops being generation and becomes verification almost immediately afterward.
Exactly, and formal proof assistants are the only thing that scales to meet that. You cannot ask Brian Conry to personally check 1,000 machine-generated papers a year. You can absolutely ask a proof checker to do it.
Now here's the detail I found almost comic. And I want you to tell me whether I should find it comic or whether I'm missing something genuinely important about how the process actually worked.
You mean the prompting? The human primarily driving those sessions was Jared Sumner, who is not a mathematician, and the reported input was mostly encouragement along the lines of keep going and believe in yourself.
A non-mathematician telling a language model to believe in itself. And out the other end comes a 25-point improvement on a bound that specialists moved by 0.2 of a point per year.
I laugh too, but there is a real lesson buried in it. The scarce human skill in that session was not mathematical knowledge. It was knowing when to let a long, expensive, apparently failing process keep running anyway.
That is a genuinely different job description than the one most research supervisors have. And I am not at all sure our institutions know how to hire for it or how to evaluate somebody who is good at it.
They do not, and there is another wrinkle. Claude itself initially expressed skepticism about its own finding, which means the system that produced the result was also the system least confident that the result was correct.
That is a strange epistemic situation, and it complicates the usual story we tell about these models being overconfident. Here, the machine appears to have been underconfident about something that then survived expert scrutiny.
And I want to keep hammering the limitation, because it is the thing most likely to get lost in the retelling. The original request was to attack the Riemann hypothesis directly, and every single one of those attempts failed completely.
So the fully accurate headline is that a system failed at its assigned problem 650 times and produced a valuable side result on the way out the door, which is a very different story.
That is exactly right, and Anthropic explicitly says it does not expect these techniques to lead toward a proof of the hypothesis itself. That is a notably unhyped thing for a company to say about its own unreleased model.
Let me raise the conflict of interest, because somebody listening is already thinking it. A company reporting a research triumph achieved by its own unreleased product is not a neutral party, however careful the write-up happens to be.
It is not neutral, and that is exactly why the external names and the lean formalization matter so much here. The claim is checkable by outsiders, which is a far stronger position than most corporate AI announcements ever occupy.
What would change your mind in either direction over the next few months? Give me the specific things you're going to be watching for before you are willing to treat any of this as settled.
Journal submission and real peer review first. Then, whether independent number theorists extend the technique to adjacent problems, which is the truest test of all, and whether the pair correlation assumptions hold up under slow, unhurried scrutiny rather than fast scrutiny.
And if all three of those land, what is the honest significance? Not the hype version, the version you would tell a skeptical colleague over coffee who does not follow this industry closely at all.
I would say a machine made a real contribution to frontier mathematics on a problem where progress is measured in fractions of a percent per year, and it did so for a compute cost that essentially rounds to nothing.
And if it does not hold up, if the assumptions turn out to be subtly wrong when somebody spends 3 months on it instead of 3 days, what have we actually learned from the whole episode?
Then we learned that the generation half of the pipeline is real and the verification half is not yet fast enough to keep up with it, which is still a useful and slightly alarming thing to have discovered.
Either way, the direction of travel seems clear to me, and I suspect the interesting arguments over the next year will be about credit and authorship rather than about raw capability, which nobody was really expecting.
Credit is going to get genuinely messy. You cannot interview a subagent about its reasoning during peer review, and 30 of the 60 contributed nothing at all. So even listing contributors becomes a strange philosophical exercise very quickly.
That is a good place to leave it, because it captures the thing I keep noticing about this story. The technical claim is narrow and checkable, and the institutional questions it opens up are enormous and completely unsettled.
My closing thought is simply this. Watch the bound. If it moves again within a year, by anyone or anything at all, then something structural about how mathematics gets done has genuinely and permanently changed.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.